The bank manager slid the death certificate across the desk. My name, my signature, my funeral. Security grabbed my arms as I lunged for it. Now I'm running through Chicago's subway with a stolen wallet, a notary's business card, and the sound of my own voice on the phone. Julian Sterling is in the boardroom right now. The man in my life isn't just an impostor. He's wearing my face. The air inside the vault lobby of the First National Bank of Chicago smelled of ozone and expensive floor wax. Julian Sterling smoothed the silk of his tie, waiting for Miller to finish tapping at the keyboard. On the mahogany desk, a brass nameplate caught the fluorescent light, gleaming with a clinical, predatory sharpness. Julian checked his watch, tapping the glass twice. He was exactly 4 minutes into a meeting that should have taken 2. David Miller, a man whose skin looked like aged parchment, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. The document bore a raised seal, heavy and cold. At the top, in stark, sans serif type, Julian read his own name beneath the word deceased. Your accounts reached 0 balance at noon, Julian. Miller's voice lacked the tremor of a man delivering a death sentence. He didn't blink. The liquidation process followed the standard protocols for an unassigned estate. According to this certified filing from the state coroner, the person sitting in this chair is legally a ghost. Julian's fingers brushed the embossed seal. The paper grain felt rough, like dried skin. He tried to swallow, but his throat had turned to sawdust. A dull hum vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of the city moving outside a window he could no longer open. I sat in your office yesterday, Miller. We drank scotch. Julian grabbed the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning the color of bone. My heart beats. I am breathing. This is a clerical error of massive proportions. Miller adjusted his spectacles, the lenses magnifying eyes as vacant as a winter sky. He pointed to the digital clock on his screen. The system does not recognize breath, Mr. Sterling. It recognizes status, and your status is terminal. Every personal asset, the penthouse on Wacker Drive, the holdings in Sterling Global, the liquid cash, it has all been transferred to the primary beneficiary listed in the updated will. What updated will? Julian's voice rose, a sharp edge cutting through the bank's muffled silence. I haven't changed my will in 5 years. The one filed 3 days ago, Miller replied, his voice as flat as a dial tone. Signed, notarized, and witnessed. You are, for all intents and purposes, erased. Julian's world shriveled to the size of that single, white page. He felt the structural integrity of his life snapping, a slow-motion collapse of a building he had spent 38 years constructing with obsessive precision. He looked at his hands, expecting them to be transparent. They were still there, solid and trembling. I need those documents. Julian reached out, his hand hovering over the death certificate. This is a forgery. I need to take this to my counsel immediately. Miller didn't move a muscle, but his eyes shifted toward the door. I cannot allow you to remove bank property, especially given your lack of standing. You have no accounts here, and therefore, no business in this building. Julian didn't wait for a formal dismissal. He lunged, his fingers clamped onto the edge of the certificate, the paper crinkling with a sharp, rhythmic snap. He pulled, but Miller's hand was already pressing down on the other side. The banker's face remained a mask of bureaucratic indifference, but his thumb pressed a silent button tucked under the mahogany lip of the desk. Give it to me, Julian hissed. The smell of Miller's peppermint breath felt like a physical assault. The heavy oak doors of the office swung open with a thud that vibrated in Julian's teeth. Two security guards, their chests encased in black tactical vests that smelled of industrial laundry detergent, stepped into the room. Their boots crunched on the carpet with a sound like breaking bone. "Mr. Miller?" the taller guard asked. His hand rested on the heavy black holster at his hip. "The gentleman is trespassing," Miller said, finally withdrawing his hand from the paper. "Please escort him from the premises and ensure he leaves the documentation behind." Julian felt the heat of panic rising in his chest, a thick, suffocating wave. He didn't just want the paper. He needed the proof that the lie existed. He tried to shove the document into his inner coat pocket, but the taller guard moved with a speed that defied his bulk. A hand like a vice clamped onto Julian's shoulder, the fingers digging into the muscle with agonizing pressure. "Let's go, pal," the guard grunted. Julian twisted, his silk suit bunching and straining. He felt a seam pop, a tiny, catastrophic sound in his ear. One of his 47 identical shirts was being ruined. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He shoved the guard's chest, feeling the hard plastic of the vest beneath the uniform. He broke for the door, sprinting past the second guard who reached out a second too late. Julian's dress shoes skidded on the polished marble of the lobby, the screech of leather on stone echoing like a bird of prey. Behind him, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots and the crackle of a radio. "Stop that man!" Miller's voice drifted from the office, thin and reedy. Julian hit the revolving doors at the front of the bank. The glass panes felt cold against his palms as he shoved. But as the door began to spin, two men in charcoal suits stepped from the shadows of the limestone pillars outside. They didn't look like bank security. They looked like predators. They moved with a synchronized grace, blocking the exit. "Julian Sterling?" the lead man asked. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and smelled of stale cigarettes and expensive cologne. "We're with Estate Recovery. We need you to come with us." Julian didn't answer. He swung his heavy leather briefcase, a solid wall of cowhide and brass. It caught the lead man in the solar plexus with a sickening oomph. The man buckled, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Julian didn't wait to see him fall. He ducked under the second man's reaching arm, the rough wool of the stranger's sleeve grazing his neck. The sidewalk was a blur of gray concrete and violet-tinted streetlights. The Chicago wind shrieked through the glass canyons, biting at Julian's face. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. He could hear them behind him, the rhythmic pounding of feet, the shouting of orders. He lunged toward the entrance of the Quincy L station. The iron stairs were slick with a fine mist of rain. He took them two at a time, his lungs burning with the sharp, metallic taste of city air. He reached the turnstile just as a train roared into the station, a wall of screeching metal and blue sparks. Julian fumbled for his transit card, but his fingers were numb. He looked back. The man with the scarred eyebrow was at the top of the stairs, his face contorted in a silent snarl. Julian didn't think. He vaulted over the turnstile, his briefcase clattering against the metal bar. A transit officer shouted, but Julian was already disappearing into the crowd on the platform. He shoved his way through a sea of damp trench coats and tired faces. The train doors hissed open, a gust of warm, recycled air hitting him in the face. He stepped inside just as the doors groaned shut. Through the scratched plexiglass, he saw the man with the scarred eyebrow reach the platform, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto Julian's for a fraction of a second before the train pulled away into the dark tunnel. Julian sank into a plastic seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in a fine layer of soot from the station. He felt a lump in his side pocket, something hard and rectangular. He reached in and pulled out a wallet. It wasn't his. In the scuffle at the revolving door, he must have snatched it from the man he floored. He opened the leather fold. There was no cash, no credit cards, just a single business card, tucked into a transparent slot. It was printed on cheap, yellowing cardstock. Michael Reynolds, Notary Public, Falls Church, Virginia. Julian stared at the name. Falls Church. His hometown? The place where the Sterling legacy had begun, and apparently, where it had been signed away to the grave. The train rattled and swayed, the screech of metal on metal filling the car. Julian pulled out his burner phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number for Sterling Global. He needed Sarah. Sarah Johnson had been his executive assistant for 15 years. She knew the serial numbers of his shirts. She knew the rhythm of his life. She would fix this. The line clicked. Sterling Global, Office of the CEO. How may I direct your call? Sarah, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. It's me. I'm out. There's been an incident at the bank. I need you to call the legal team. Tell them to meet me at the safe house on Dearborn. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. Julian could hear the faint hum of the office ventilation, a sound he had heard every day for a decade. Then, Sarah's voice came through. But it was strange. Hollowed out, brittle with a fear he didn't understand. I'm sorry, she said, her voice a ghost of itself. Who is this? Sarah, stop playing. It's Julian. I've been flagged as deceased. Some kind of fraud. I need the credentials for the secondary server. Now. Mr. Sterling? Sarah's voice trembled. Mr. Sterling is currently in a board meeting. He's been there for the last hour, finalizing the merger with the Henderson Group. I don't know who you are, but this is a highly inappropriate joke. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The train car seemed to tilt, the fluorescent lights flickering with a nauseating rhythm. Sarah, listen to me. Look at the door. Who is sitting in my chair? The CEO is, she whispered. Julian is. He's wearing the charcoal suit. The one he wore for the gala. Please, don't call this line again. I'll have to report this to security. The line went dead. The dial tone hissed in Julian's ear like a snake. He stared at the phone, the plastic feeling cold and alien in his palm. He wasn't just dead on paper. He had been replaced in the flesh. Subverted. Julian gripped the phone so hard the casing groaned. He knew exactly what he had to do. This was a tactical error by the impostor, leaving a witness like Sarah, who knew Julian's soul. He would call the firm's private security line, the one handled by a firm he'd personally vetted for a decade. They had his voice prints. They had his biometrics. They would see through the theater. He dialed the emergency code. He felt a surge of confidence, a return of the Sterling precision. The system would recognize the frequency of his voice, the specific cadence of his speech. It was a failsafe he had designed himself for exactly this kind of unlikely scenario. Security Alpha, a voice answered. It was Miller, not the banker, but Marcus Miller, the head of his personal detail. Identify. Code 79er Echo, Julian said, his voice steadying. This is Julian Sterling. I am experiencing a Tier 1 identity compromise. I need an extraction at the Grand Avenue station. Verify my voice print. Voice print verified, Marcus replied. Julian felt a wave of relief so potent it made his knees weak. He slumped back against the vibrating wall of the train. We see you, Julian. We've been tracking the burner. The man in the office. He's good. But he's not you. We're 5 minutes out. Stay on the platform. Julian closed his eyes, a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had built this system to be impenetrable. He had outsmarted the shadow. He stepped off the train at Grand Avenue, his posture straightening, the Arthur Vane rags of his current state feeling like a temporary costume. He waited near the concrete pillar, watching the stairs. He saw Marcus descend. The man moved with a familiar, heavy-set grace. Julian stepped forward, hand extended. "Marcus, thank God. We need to move fast. He's in the boardroom." Marcus didn't take his hand. He didn't even stop. He kept walking until he was inches from Julian's face. Behind him, 4 more men appeared, fanning out in a tactical diamond. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the warmth they'd shared over 1,000 late-night shifts. "The man in the office isn't Julian, but he's the one who signed the new contract. He's the one who just authorized a 20% bump in our retention bonuses." Julian's heart skipped a beat. A cold prickle danced across his skin. "Marcus, what are you saying? You just verified my voice." "I did," Marcus said, leaning in. He smelled of gun oil and peppermint. "And that's the problem. As long as you're alive, the voice print is a liability. The board doesn't want the real Julian. The real Julian is difficult. The real Julian counts his shirts. The new guy, he just wants to get paid and disappear. And he wants us to make sure you do the same." The world tilted. The failsafe hadn't been a shield. It had been a homing beacon. By proving who he was, Julian had simply confirmed he was the target that needed to be eliminated. Marcus reached for his waistband, and Julian realized with a sickening jolt that his own precision had just written his death warrant. He spun and bolted into the dark of the tunnel, the sound of his own name being shouted behind him like a curse. He spent the next 3 hours as a shadow, moving through the alleyways where the violet streetlights couldn't reach. The city felt different now. Hostile, a machine designed to grind him into the soot. Every police siren made his skin crawl. He realized Caleb. It had to be Caleb, his twin, the spare who had vanished 10 years ago. Hadn't just stolen his life. He had weaponized Julian's own habits against him. By morning, Julian saw his own face on the digital billboards above the Kennedy Expressway. But the name beneath the high-cheekboned, familiar visage wasn't Julian Sterling. Wanted for questioning, Arthur Vane. Age, unknown. Extremely dangerous. Mentally unstable. Caleb had turned Julian's physical body into a legal liability. If a cop saw him, they wouldn't see a billionaire. They would see a vagrant who had stolen a dead man's face. Julian ducked his head, pulling the collar of his ruined coat higher. He caught his reflection in a puddle of oily water. He looked like a ghost. He spoke to himself in a whisper, his voice trembling with a vain whisper. "My name is Julian?" he asked the reflection. The question mark at the end of his own name felt like a physical weight, pulling him down into the gutter. He needed a place to hide, somewhere the Sterling global reach didn't extend. He remembered a name from his father's old, disgraced files. Robert Vance, a man who had survived the collapse of his own life. Julian found the boarding house on the south side, a crumbling brick building that looked like it was being held together by the thick layers of soot and ivy. The air here smelled of wet ash and old, forgotten fires. He knocked on the heavy oak door, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The door creaked open, revealing a man with a barrel chest and a prosthetic leg that groaned with every shift of weight. Robert Vance didn't look at Julian's face. His eyes darted to the ceiling, counting the tiles in the entryway. 96 tiles. Vance grunted. Sit down. You look like you've been run over by a building. I'm looking for shelter, Julian said, his voice barely audible over the hiss of a nearby radiator. Vance squinted at him, his scowl deepening. He pulled a crumpled newspaper from his pocket and held it up to Julian's face. The headline screamed about the Vane manhunt. Police say you're crazy, Vance said, leaning against the doorframe. They say you think you're a dead billionaire. But I knew your father, kid. He was a bastard, but he was a precise bastard. And you? You're wearing a $3,000 watch with a 10-cent coat. That's not crazy. That's a man who's been hollowed out. Vance stepped back, gesturing into the stifling heat of the common room. A dinner table was set for 12, but the plates were filled with dusty plastic fruit. Stay in the back room, don't touch the windows, and if you hear me counting, you keep your mouth shut. Julian collapsed onto a cot that smelled of lavender and mothballs. For the first time in 48 hours, the hum of the city felt distant. But the peace was a lie. At 3 a.m., the sound of glass shattering erupted from the front of the house. Julian bolted upright, the smell of gasoline and scorched dust filling his lungs. An orange glow flickered under the door. Vance, Julian screamed. He threw open the door. The hallway was a vortex of black smoke and roaring heat. Through the haze, he saw a man in a tactical mask holding a glass bottle wrapped in a burning rag. A firebomb. Julian grabbed a heavy red fire extinguisher from the wall. He didn't think about blueprints or precision. He thought about survival. He squeezed the handle, a cloud of white chemical powder erupting into the assassin's face. The man stumbled back, blinded, the bottle slipping from his hand and shattering on his own boots. The assassin shrieked as the flames climbed his legs. Julian didn't stay to watch. He ran for the end of the hall, the heat searing the hair on his arms. He hit the window at a dead run, his shoulders shattering the glass. He felt the cold night air for a fraction of a second before he plunged toward the concrete alley below. He hit a dumpster first, the rusted metal groaning under his weight, before rolling onto the pavement. His shoulders screamed in protest, a jagged, white-hot pain that made his vision blur. He looked up. The boarding house was a pillar of fire, a funeral pyre for the last man who might have helped him. He crawled into the shadows, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He needed a professional, someone who lived in the cracks of the law. He met Megan Foster in a secluded corner of Grant Park beneath the shadow of a darkened fountain. She was 29, with messy auburn hair and ink stains on her fingers that looked like bruises. She looked at Julian's bruised face and the way he clutched his arm. "You're the ghost," she whispered. She handed him a thick manila envelope. "I'm a paralegal at the firm that handled your estate. I saw the wire transfers, Julian. Millions of dollars moving into accounts that don't exist, authorized by signatures that look like yours, but they're too perfect. No one's signature is that consistent." Julian opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the documents, the familiar Sterling Global letterhead mocking him. "These are the liquidation orders. They're emptying the foundation. If they finish this, there's nothing left to reclaim. The company will be a hollow shell." "There's more," Megan said, her voice trembling. She began to hum "Happy Birthday" under her breath, a soft, haunting melody that made Julian's skin crawl. The death certificate. It wasn't just a bank error. It was signed by Thomas Crawford. Julian felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Thomas? He's my godfather. He's the one who held me at my baptism. He wouldn't." "He did," Megan said, refusing to meet his eyes. "He's the county coroner. His signature is on the original filing. He's the one who told the world you were a corpse. Julian leaned against a cold stone bench. The conspiracy wasn't a corporate takeover. It was a family execution. Everyone he had trusted had been bought or broken. "We need the birth records," Julian said, his voice hardening. "Caleb was never officially registered. My father hid him after the scandal. If we can find the original hospital intake from the archives, we can prove there were two of us. We can prove the deceased Julian has a living shadow. They moved through the city like thieves, infiltrating the city archives at midnight. The building was a cathedral of paper, with rows of filing cabinets that stretched into the darkness like the ribs of a giant beast. The sound of dripping water echoed from an unseen leak. Plink, 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 counting down the seconds. Subverted. Julian moved with surgical intent. He knew the filing system. He had designed the renovation for this wing 5 years ago. He led Megan to the sealed records vault, a high-security cage that required a physical key and a specific sequence of overrides. "This is it," Julian whispered, his heart racing. "The unassigned births of 1985. My father kept the records here because he knew the digital grid would eventually be scrubbed. This is the one place the Sterling precision actually works for us." He manipulated the lock, the tumblers clicking with a satisfying, rhythmic snap. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hope. This was the smoking gun. With this paper, Detective Jenkins would have to listen. With this paper, the DNA wouldn't matter because the context would be undeniable. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, his fingers trembling as he flipped to the month of May. "Here," he said, pointing to a line of faded ink. "Sterling, Julian, and beneath it, Sterling, Caleb, twin A and twin B, both alive, both healthy." He looked at Megan, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. "We got him. This is the legal foundation. We can rebuild everything from this one page." He tucked the ledger under his arm, already imagining the look on Caleb's face in the courtroom. They turned to leave, but the heavy steel door of the vault didn't budge. Julian shoved, but the handle was dead. A voice crackled over the vault's internal intercom, a voice that was a perfect mocking mirror of his own. "You always were obsessed with the foundation, Jules," Caleb's voice echoed in the small stone room. "But you forgot one thing. I didn't just study your life. I studied your buildings. I knew you'd come here. It's exactly what a precise man would do." Julian froze. He looked at the security camera in the corner. The red light was pulsing like a heartbeat. "The birth records aren't a weapon, Julian," Caleb continued, his tone breezy and cruel. "They're a confession. Look at the bottom of the page. Look at the stamp." Julian looked. Beneath the names of the twins, there was a purple stamp from the State Department of Health, dated 2 days ago. "Voided. Record declared fraudulent per internal audit." "I didn't just find the records, brother," Caleb whispered. "I reported them as forgeries you planted years ago to cover up your instability. By finding them, you've just proven the police narrative. You're a man obsessed with a twin who doesn't exist, caught breaking into a restricted vault to steal evidence that the state has already flagged as a lie." The heavy fire suppression vents in the ceiling began to hiss. A thick, white gas, halon, began to pour into the room, designed to starve a fire of oxygen. Julian lunged for the door, but his lungs were already beginning to burn. He hadn't found the truth. He had walked into his own coffin, and the very evidence he'd risked his life for was now the weight that would sink him. The vault filled with a suffocating mist. Julian fell to his knees, the leather ledger slipping from his fingers. He looked at Megan, who was slumped against the wall, her eyes fluttering. "I'm sorry," he gasped. The word felt like a jagged stone in his throat. Suddenly, a muffled thump vibrated through the floor. The heavy steel door groaned, the metal warping outward as if struck by a massive force. A crowbar jammed into the seam, followed by the screech of a hydraulic jack. Robert Vance stepped through the opening, his prosthetic legs sparking against the metal floor. He wore a gas mask and carried a second one in his hand. He didn't say a word. He shoved the mask onto Julian's face and hoisted Megan over his shoulder. 74 steps to the exit. Vance grunted through the mask. "Move." They emerged into the cool night air of the alleyway, coughing and gasping. Vance leaned against the brick wall, his chest heaving. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice a raw scratch. "You could have stayed hidden." "Caleb burned my house," Vance said, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "He broke the count. Nobody breaks the count." But the reprieve was short-lived. A black sedan screeched into the alley, its headlights blinding them. Detective Sarah Jenkins stepped out, her service weapon drawn. Her pen clicked in a rapid-fire burst. Click, click, click. "Hands in the air, Vane," she shouted. "Or Sterling, whoever you are. You're under arrest for burglary, arson, and the attempted murder of Caleb Sterling. He's the one who set the fire." Julian screamed, his hands shaking as he raised them. "He's in the building." Jenkins didn't blink. She walked forward, the smell of industrial bleach from the precinct still clinging to her uniform. She pulled a handheld device from her belt. "Caleb Sterling voluntarily provided a DNA sample this morning. We ran it against the skin cells found at the boarding house. It's a match. To the law, you are the shadow. You are the anomaly." She slammed Julian against the car, the cold metal biting into his cheek. She ratcheted the handcuffs shut. 1, 2, 3. The sound final and cold. Julian was thrown into a holding cell at the first precinct. The walls were cinder block, painted a sickly cream color that seemed to shrink inward with every tick of the wall clock. The clock was running backward. Julian watched the seconds unhappen, a silent scream building in his chest. He had 3 hours. 3 hours until the gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Caleb would sign the final papers to dissolve Sterling Global and vanish with the family fortune. He looked at the ceiling. He knew this room. He had overseen the structural reinforcement of the precinct's holding wing after a series of escapes in the 90s. He remembered the ventilation shafts. They were the one part of the building that hadn't been updated to the new code because of a budget dispute. "The flaw," Julian whispered. He stood on the metal cot, his fingers searching the edges of the ceiling panel. There, a gap of 0.04 millimeters. He jammed a plastic spoon he'd hidden from his last meal into the crack, prying with a desperate, rhythmic force. The panel popped, a shower of dust and dead insects falling into his eyes. He hauled himself up into the dark, narrow duct. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and cold iron. He moved like a ghost through the building's lungs, his memory of the blueprints guiding him through the labyrinth. He emerged in a maintenance closet on the ground floor, slipping out into the night just as a police cruiser pulled into the lot. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a fortress of light and glass. Tuxedoed men and women in silk gowns flowed up the marble steps, their laughter sounding like breaking glass in the crisp air. Julian didn't have a tuxedo. He had a torn coat, a bruised face, and a jagged scar on his forearm. A souvenir from a childhood accident where he'd fallen through a greenhouse roof while Caleb watched and laughed. He used the service entrance, entering a security code he had memorized years ago. The guards were busy watching the front, distracted by the glitter of the elite. Julian moved through the shadows of the Greek statues, their cold stone eyes judging his desperation. He reached the main stage just as Caleb took the podium. Caleb looked perfect. His suit was a midnight blue, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the spotlight. He cracked his knuckles, thumb, index, pinky, and smiled at the crowd. "Tonight?" Caleb said, his voice smooth and theatrical. "We close one chapter of the Sterling legacy to begin another. My brother, Julian, would have wanted this. He would have wanted us to look toward the horizon, not the past." "Liars don't get to speak for the dead," Julian shouted, stepping from behind a velvet curtain. The room went silent. 1,000 heads turned. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked at Julian with a patronizing pity. "Arthur," Caleb said, his voice amplified by the speakers, "I told the officers you were unwell. Please, let the security team take you to the hospital. You need help." Detective Jenkins stepped from the wings, her hand on her holster. "That's enough, Vane. Get on the ground." Julian didn't move. He looked directly at Caleb. "Tell them about the greenhouse, Caleb. Tell them about the day Mom died. Tell them what she said to us before the car left." Caleb's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He adjusted his tie. 1, 2, 3. "She told us to be brave, Julian. She told us to take care of each other. Everyone knows that story. It's in the biography." "No," Julian said, walking toward the edge of the stage. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing the jagged, ropey scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "She didn't say a word. She was unconscious. And you weren't even there. You were hiding in the basement because you were afraid of the blood. I'm the one who pulled the glass out of my arm, trying to reach her. I'm the one who carries the mark of that day." He turned to the crowd, then to Jenkins. "Caleb hates flaws. He hates anything that isn't precise. He had his skin surgically scrubbed 5 years ago to remove his birthmarks and his scars. He wanted to be a clean version of me. Check his arm, detective. Check for the scar that every medical record says Julian Sterling has carried since he was 10 years old." Jenkins looked at Caleb. The metronome of her pen stopped. Click. "Mr. Sterling?" she asked. "Show me your arm." Caleb's face contorted, the smirk finally vanishing to reveal the predatory void beneath. He reached into his jacket, but Vance was already there, stepping from the shadows of a pillar to pin Caleb's arms behind his back. Jenkins pulled back Caleb's sleeve. The skin was smooth, pristine, and utterly fake. "The DNA matched," Jenkins whispered, looking from the scar on Julian's arm to the empty skin on Caleb's. "Because you're twins. But the body doesn't lie." The room erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs popped like tiny explosions. Caleb was led away in huffing, silent rage, his rhythmic knuckle cracking the only sound he made as the handcuffs bit into his wrists. Weeks later, Julian sat in his office. The marble was still cold, the fluorescent lights still hummed, but the room felt different. He had spent his life trying to be a machine, a sequence of perfect code that couldn't be deleted. He looked at the computer on his desk. He reached out and pulled the plug. The screen died with a soft, electronic sigh. He picked up a pen, a heavy brass fountain pen, and a stack of paper. He began to write the blueprints for the next building by hand. His handwriting was messy, the ink occasionally smudging on his cuff. He didn't go home to change. He just kept writing, the scratch of the nib on the page the only sound in the quiet room. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a stain on his shirt and a scar on his arm. And for the first time in his life, the foundation was solid.